Thank you very much, and it's lovely to be back in Exeter. I just had a bit of a flashback coming in. The last time I was at Exeter University was just before the general election, and it's the one and only time in my life that I've had security. The university was so worried about the number of people who'd signed to come along that they insisted that the young Greens here at the university have a couple of security people with me. So I had 2 people on my shoulder all evening, which was an experience that I've never had before or since, and really was quite an experience. Now I do have to apologise for my voice this evening. I often say that I believe in a work-life balance, but I don't have one. My vocal cords are definitely feeling my lack of work-life balance at the moment, so I apologise for that. Just a couple of things to introduce myself. You might have already picked it, even through the frog in my throat, that my accent comes from Australia originally. And I'm unusual in politics in that my first degree was agricultural science. And there's not very many people in politics with a scientific background, which I think is a real pity. But when you put those 2 things together, one of the things the media has got most excited about me is the fact that I'm probably the only British political leader who knows how to shear a sheep. That probably tells you more about the media than it does about me, actually. But there's one subject this evening, the focus of the talk, and that is the European referendum that's coming up very, very soon. And indeed, yesterday I was on the BBC locally this evening, and they were very excited because the talk I'm giving tonight is the first one since we officially launched the Greens for a Better Europe campaign yesterday in London. So, you know, television always likes a first. So Exeter University's got a first. So here we are, Yes to Europe, a campaign that's saying Greens for a Better Europe. The hashtag is Greener In. And very simply, we believe that we flourish best when we work together jointly on the problems that we face. And that's why we believe that we should remain in the EU. When you think about it, there's lots of joint problems that we face. As the Green Party, we talk a great deal about air pollution. And air pollution doesn't respect boundaries. About 1/3 of the air pollution we experience in Britain comes from continental Europe. A good part of their air pollution comes from us. You think about pollution of our seas. If we dump some stuff in the English Channel, I'm being polite here, I could use another more agricultural term, but if we dump some stuff in the English Channel, some of it will end up in France. If France dumps stuff in the Channel, some of it ends up with us. One of the things that indeed the BBC was challenging me on was the whole issue of fish stocks. And you know, I've actually heard some people from the other side saying we should leave the EU because then we'll get back control of our fish. I haven't seen a lot of fish swimming around with a passport tucked underneath their fin. They'd probably swim a bit sort of in circles if they did, really. And they don't stop at borders. And we know actually with climate change that fish stocks are moving around. You know, it's not sensible to talk about our fish. And they were saying, oh, you know, couldn't we basically take more fish out of the ocean if we left the EU? Well, no, because we're already taking too many fish out of the ocean. The limits to what we can take aren't set by any human rule. They're actually set by the biology, set by the amount of stocks that can be replaced. And then, of course, there's lots of other things like workers' rights. And the EU guarantees all sorts of workers' rights in terms of things like holidays, in terms of things like treatment of agency workers, in terms of things like maternity leave. Now, all of those things, what we need is a foundational standard set across Europe. That's what the EU does. If you have a situation where neighbouring countries can burrow underneath each other, undercut each other, then what you've got is a race to the bottom, the kind of the race to the bottom that we've seen very much in corporate tax rates. Which of course brings me to another point, because when we think about one of the great problems we need to face in the world today, it's the fact that big multinational corporations are not paying their taxes. I talk a lot about the website Amazon, which is actually a parasite. You think about the road down the hill from there, today there were lorries carrying Amazon parcels running up and down that road. And everybody in this room, you're paying taxes to help to maintain that road. But Amazon isn't paying its taxes for the road. It's not paying its taxes towards maintaining our NHS, these health services that we need, that their customers need, that their workers need, not maintaining the schools their workers need. And what the EU can, and slowly and increasingly is starting to do, is really take on that issue of big corporations not paying their taxes. And when you think about the size of these corporations, it makes a lot more sense to be able to have the size, the bulk of the EU taking them on, rather than Britain doing it alone. And in fact, this is something that Molly Scott-Cato, the brilliant MEP from the Southwest, the Green MEP who was elected a couple of years ago, one of the things she's been focusing on in the European Parliament is looking at rules to rein in the corporates, the out-of-control corporates. And there's some real progress being made in that. And one of the things that, of course, the EU has been focusing on is the financial sector and bankers' bonuses. And our 3 Green MEPs from England, they've been there in the European Parliament with a group of 50 really fighting on that bankers' bonuses. And there's been a cap put on bankers' bonuses. And that, of course, is no thanks to our government here in Westminster, the government that actually used taxpayers' money to try and stop that cap on bankers' bonuses. Then there's the part of the EU that probably affects most people in this room, or is likely to affect your future the most. And that's the free movement of people. And in the Green Party, we celebrate the free movement of people in the EU. This is something that enriches all of our lives, enriches the possibility of all of our lives. Anyone in this room might get an Erasmus scholarship, go and study in Rome for a year. Maybe you've had enough of studying for a while and you might want to go an au pair in Paris for a year. Perhaps, I don't want to be ageist, but if you, perhaps your parents or grandparents might retire to the Costa del whatever. And, you know, with perhaps a retirement income that's not so great from the British state, they can live better there than they can in their own country. That's their choice. And that's one of the things that I think we've seen really not nearly enough discussion about. There are 1.4 million Britons living in continental Europe. And they're already now living with considerable uncertainty, thinking, what's our future? What does this mean for us? Where are we going? What's happening? And they're living with that uncertainty because we have this referendum. And if we were to decide in this referendum to leave the EU, their position would be really unclear, really uncertain, much more difficult than their lives are now. Now, I think it's really important to sort of front on the whole issue of immigration, because I know that when you're contesting the elections here in Exeter, you go and knock on doors, a lot of people will say, if you ask them what they're most concerned about, what issues are they most concerned about, they'll say immigration. And indeed, in the BBC questions tonight, they were saying, oh, you know, people are concerned about crowded schools and hospitals. People are concerned about the fact that housing's really expensive, there's not enough council houses, and, you know, isn't that a reason to leave the EU? And I would say no. And what we really need to do is identify why we have those problems, as well as a really low-wage economy with insecure employment. And the reason why we have all of those things is not because of immigration. It's not because of our membership of the EU. It's because of government policies, failed government policies over the past few decades. If you think about low wages, we have an inadequate minimum wage, inadequately enforced. You think about home care workers. I was having a visit today with Aged Care UK, and social care is horribly underfunded, and we're not actually paying home care workers what's supposed to be the legal minimum wage. They are paid for a half-hour appointment here, an hour appointment there, and not paid for the travelling time in between. Now actually, it is actually the EU, rules from the EU that have been applied that have started to say those workers have to be paid for that travelling time. That's the EU standing up for workers' rights, rights that should apply right across the continent. Then if you think about crowded hospitals, well, we've had massive privatisation of the NHS. We've got the huge cost of PFI schemes, private finance initiative schemes, and we've got the fact that this government is cutting, in real terms, funding for the NHS. It plans by 2020 to be using 6.7% of GDP on health spending. Now, even if you add 1.1% of private health spending from Britain in, that's very significantly less than both France and Germany, who both spend about 11% of GDP on healthcare. And of course, we've got this race to privatisation. We've got the government rushing towards the American healthcare model, despite the fact that America uses about twice the percentage of GDP on healthcare we do for actually far worse outcomes. And then we get to schools. I can just say Michael Gove, really, and that pretty well covers what's wrong with our schools. The whole free schools program, and we can see the government pushing even further with that today. The free schools program has meant that local authorities aren't able to plan to put schools where they know they're going to be needed, where they know that there's a baby boom coming through. They have to wait for someone to come along and want to open a free school. And free schools are opening in places where they're not needed, while places where there are big gaps are left without enough school places. And then finally, housing. We have relied on the market to supply housing for the past couple of decades. We've sold off 1.5 million council homes under right to buy. And as I was talking with the aged care people today, now increasingly what we're seeing is those former council homes are in the hands of private landlords. People are having to live in the same homes as they might have before, but pay massively more rent. And to afford that rent, what you're seeing is that they're getting housing benefit. So public money is going straight into the pockets of private landlords. None of those things are caused by the EU. They're caused by failed government policies. So I'm not, however, here to say that the EU is some kind of perfect organisation. Of course it isn't. There's a lot wrong with the EU. And I'd start with the proposed EU-US free trade deal that's known as TTIP. Now, the Green Party has led opposition to TTIP right across the EU. We've been at the absolute forefront, and I'm proud of that. But don't let anybody tell you that TTIP is a reason to leave the EU. Because if we weren't a member of the EU, we would have successive governments, Labour or Tory, would have signed an equivalent deal to TTIP between the US and the UK in a flash. You think about it, this government, if it was left in their hands to do a trade deal with the US, some of the hideous things about TTIP, the ISDS, the Investor State Dispute Settlement Procedure, which leaves a situation where governments who make democratic decisions in the interests of their own citizens are then left facing potential massive fines through secret courts, well, not even courts, secret tribunals. ISDS, our government would sign up to that. You take what's known as harmonisation, such a nice sounding word, isn't it? Who could object to a bit of harmony? But what TTIP's suggesting, what our government would sign up to in a flash, is bringing together the regulations on things like food safety. Now, in the US, their factory farming standards are so terrible that they regularly wash chicken carcasses in bleach to get the bacterial load down to an edible level. In the EU, that's illegal. I'd like to keep it that way, not see that kind of harmonisation of standards that, again, is the race to the bottom. So in the EU, we've got lots of people opposing TTIP. 3.4 million people have signed a cross-EU petition on this. I think it's possibly one of the largest petitions ever. In Berlin, there were 250,000 people marching on the streets opposing TTIP, simply on that one issue. Now, I'd love to think we could get 250,000 people on the streets of London, but I don't think on TTIP. I'm not sure that's going to happen anytime soon. We can, however, keep working on it. Now, there's a lot wrong with the level of democracy in Brussels, but then there's an awful lot wrong with the level of democracy in Westminster. We have a government that has the support of only 24% of eligible voters. Even if you count the people who voted, among the people who voted, only 39% of people voted Tory. Now, I was having a conversation with a visiting Swedish Green housing minister, and he said to me, "But you can't form a government with 39% support." So I began my explanation of Britain's archaic, amazing first-past-the-post electoral system. I've done this so many times with continental European Greens that I've kind of got it down pat, right to the pauses for the gasps of astonishment at how undemocratic it actually is. So we need reform in Brussels, but boy do we need reform in Westminster too. The local Green parties from around the region, we had a meeting of Devon and Somerset Green parties this afternoon talking about the whole devolution agenda. Now, the government's idea of devolution is that basically we'll tell you how to organise things at your local level. That's not my idea of devolution, and yet that's what Westminster is inflicting on people, instead of starting from the grassroots up and saying, right, why don't you all get together and decide how you'd like to run things? So there's a lot wrong with Brussels, there's a lot wrong with Westminster, and the answer is not to give up on democracy. The answer is not to say, oh, well, we're just going to walk away. The answer is to stay in, to fight for reform, to work for reform across the EU. And that is something that we're seeing more and more, because this is really very clearly an era of political change. The Green surge last year, in the general election, we got 1.1 million votes, which was more votes than we've got in every general election previously added together. Cumulatively, more votes in one election than every previous one. We saw the Green surge that saw membership more than treble. And also, of course, we saw the SNP in Scotland. And the rate of political change is even a year before the election. Anyone would have told you Glasgow is safe Labour, it'll be safe Labour forever. You count the Labour vote in numbers of wheelbarrows. And yet what happened was the Scottish people, in part energised by their referendum, looked at the state of politics and said, we're not happy with this right-wing Labour Party, we're not going to take it anymore. And they voted in ways that no one a year earlier would have predicted. And then, of course, we saw, after the election of Jeremy Corbyn as Labour leader. He started at odds of 200 to 1. Anyone who's a betting person will tell you the 200 to 1 horse never wins. But that wasn't what happened in that election. And I do like to note that actually Sian Berry, who's our candidate for Mayor of London, her odds are a lot shorter than Jeremy Corbyn's were. And then, of course, it's not just in the UK. In America, Bernie Sanders is doing vastly better than anyone thought he was going to do. You might have noticed that we do have a little local connection with that, because the Green Party health spokesperson is Larry Sanders, yes, his brother, a former Oxford councillor. And of course, if we look across to Europe, you've got Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain. What you have is real signs of political change. People are saying we're not going to take this anymore. So it's a time of possibility, but this is also a time of risk, because I believe it would be absolutely disastrous for Britain if we leave the EU. And it's also worth thinking about how disastrous it would be for the EU if Britain was to leave. What would be our impact on the rest of the Union? And that's why I think it's really important, and if there's one message you take away from tonight, I've got one message for you, and this isn't even a directional message. It's a very simple message, which is make sure you can have your say in this referendum. We know that since the government changed the method of electoral registration, millions of people have fallen off the electoral roll, and particularly millions of young people have fallen off the electoral roll. Now, I'd urge everyone, if you're not 100% sure you're on the electoral roll, go home tonight and check. Just Google electoral registration. It's a very simple procedure. Go home and check that you're on the electoral roll. Because one of the things I'm worried about is that we could see, and I really do hope we do, that this referendum campaign really catching fire and really seeing an increased level of engagement. This is a real opportunity. I know lots of people are fed up with party politics. When you look at the average Prime Minister's questions, I don't really blame them. You know, making chicken noises at each other across the chamber in PMQs. You know, 10-year-olds in the playground would be a bit embarrassed by that behaviour. Yet that's the kind of thing we regularly see in Prime Minister's questions. So that's turned a lot of people off. And yet what I see this referendum is a real opportunity to get people engaged. And it's particularly important to get young people engaged. And it could be the deciding factor in this referendum, because the figures show that young people are much more in favour of the European Union than people in older age groups. I've seen surveys that show 65 to 70% of young people are firmly in favour of remaining in the EU. Yet if those young people are not registered to vote, if they don't turn out and vote, that preference is not going to show in the vote. And it could be that the over 70s are the ones who decide. And this is making a decision that's going to have an impact on Britain, on Europe, for decades. So it's really important, a critical message. I'd urge everyone to go home and tweet, or Facebook, or whatever you Snapchat, or whatever you do. Go home and say to all your friends, are you registered to vote? Just one simple key question. And please make sure you are, because this really matters. It's a critical decision. It's a decision that affects people for decades in the future. And you know, we tried very hard to get 16 and 17-year-olds the vote. We've been trying to get 16 and 17-year-olds the vote for a long time. They had the vote in Scotland. We should have had the vote now. That really unlikely champion of 16 and 17-year-olds, the House of Lords, even tried to get them the vote. Didn't work out, but that makes it even more important that 18, 19, 20, 21, 22-year-olds do vote. If nothing else, vote for your younger brothers and sisters. This is really critically important. So I always believe that dialogue is more interesting than monologue, so I'm not going to go on for much further, but I will just offer some final thoughts in terms of where we are now in politics, because it really is a time of change. What we've seen is the last 35 years or so, politics has been hugely narrow. It's been dominated by a politics that you might call neoliberal, neo-Thatcherite. It's a politics that says greed is good, inequality doesn't matter, and we can keep trashing the planet, and somehow it'll all work out. That's clearly failed now, even in its own terms. It's based on a growth model, an economy, an assumption that we can just keep having infinite growth on a finite planet. It's based on a model that says, you know, inequality, which has now gone past Edwardian levels and heading to Victorian levels, isn't going to do massive damage to our social fabric. It's based on a principle that says it's okay in this, the world's 6th largest economy, that significant numbers of people can be left not able to put food on the table, keep a roof over their head. That neoliberal politics has failed. It's on its last legs. And I have a theory of political change, which is political change doesn't really happen slowly and gradually. I mean, in the Green Party, we're very familiar with that. The idea that you slog around, deliver lots of leaflets, eventually get your first councillor elected, you slog around, knock on a lot more doors, deliver a lot more leaflets, get your second councillor elected. But real political change doesn't happen like that. It happens in big leaps. And the last real political change we saw in Britain was the rise of Margaret Thatcher. Nothing has really changed since then, but it's time to see another real massive change. And when we look at what's wrong with the EU, a lot of what's wrong with the EU comes from the fact that it has been operating through those 35 years of neoliberal politics. You know, the continental Europe was never quite as neoliberal as Britain, but it had an impact. And people are now looking for something different. And it's very simple, really, about the EU. People are asking me, how do you change the EU? What happens is you elect different kinds of politicians, and you get a different kind of politics, and you get a different kind of EU. It's in our hands, all of us, as voters. In Britain, it's the one UK-wide fair election conducted through proportional representation. We send MEPs to Brussels to democratically have their say. That's what we need to do. Send the right people there, and then we'll get the right kind of EU. It's in all of your hands, but only if you vote to remain in the EU. So I'd urge you to do that. Thank you.